This presentation is called Creative Mobility. It's a summary of the talk I gave at the Differential Mobilities conference on May 9th, 2013. Here, I will outline one aspect of my research creation project, and part of my research involves redefining the parallels between creativity and originality. I mean to critique the mainstream production of visual arts and, more generally, an aesthetic system that encourages artists to fix their output within a very limited range of forms and ideas so that they may better impose their signature style as intellectual property, rather than a more distributed, exploratory, and eclectic mode of production, which I feel is closer to an approach that resonates with current times. Simultaneously to articulating this theory, I will also demonstrate it with a few examples of artworks which typically stick to a fixed rule of originality, meaning one artist doing one thing, but also I will show other examples from a more mobile view, like one artist doing many things. All this, I hope, will create a better context for framing my own work, which incidentally pledges more for the second approach. Now, the analytical method I use here to link up one creative approach and a specific time period is that of historical materialism, as coined by Karl Marx. For those unfamiliar with this method, the quickest way for me to encapsulate it would be to paraphrase Marshall McLuhan and say, "The economy is the message." Here, instead of saying that the use of specific technological tools will determine the content of one's expression, I claim this Marxian method instead establishes that it's the means by which a social group provides for its own subsistence. This is what will shape the narrative substance of their culture. Broadly speaking, by culture, here Marx intends a larger category than visual arts to include the traditions, laws, mythology, religion, as well as the arts and crafts of a given social group. Let's think, for example, of a more rudimentary tribal society structured on a hunting economy, where hunting is the basic means of subsistence. Well, this society will also tend to produce, say, cave paintings mainly on the theme of hunting. And with the emergence of agriculture as a means of food production, in agricultural societies, we will see the emergence of sun, earth, and rain gods and other spirits expected to exert an influence on the activity of agriculture. So, in a nutshell, what Marx is saying is that there wasn't any harvesting gods before the practice of harvesting. But what about more complex societies? Societies closer to ours, such as industrial capitalism in the late 19th and early 20th century? How is that economy reflected culturally? I would argue that the introduction of the assembly line in industrial factories, and more specifically the divisions in labor forces on the assembly line, this is parallel in artistic movements of the same period. Similarly to the worker specializing on one section of the assembly line, artists of this same period have often associated a sense of originality with a self-imposed limitation of their own visual and conceptual vocabulary. To this end, we see Mondrian's colored squares, or Jackson Pollock's paint drippings. We can even associate this approach to more recent art forms like Daniel Buren's stripes and Peter Halley's cell paintings. I find all these artists operate as aesthetic specialists, or in other words, as creative monopolies. Now, what about today's post-industrial economy, which operates more through customization than via standardization? Today's economy is now dominated not by outputting standard commodities in a serial way to undifferentiated customers, but is rather exemplified by activities such as the provision of financial advice, the delivery of healthcare, and more generally, the processing of information. These are all highly individualized services, and the shapes they take can change significantly from one client to the next. This economy was also instrumental in the transformation of media, in the paradigm shift from broadcasting to networking. As opposed to broadcasting, which operates in a one-to-many fashion, information networks perform under a many-to-many formula. The latter, this way, carries much more potential to increase the mobility between the traditionally fixed roles of consumer, creator, and curator of culture. This new economy, which came to maturity in the 1990s, was fueled by the democratization of digital production tools, like the computer, of course, but this phenomenon actually took many decades to emerge, as witnessed from the evolution of fax machines, video cameras, wireless communication, and so on. Again, this democratizing culture allows for many more users to start their own company with a minimum of means. And similarly, on an individual level, many more can become creative as artists, or on a more prosaic level, as participants in the sharing economy of social networks. Now let's look at the work of 3 successful creatively mobile artists. First, this is Martin Kiepenberger, a German artist, most influential in the 1980s and 90s. His refusal to adopt a specific style and medium in which to show his images resulted in an extremely varied oeuvre, to include an amalgamation of paintings, sculpture, works on paper, photographs, installation, prints, and ephemera. Kiepenberger spoke of his production as a reflection on the turn of the millennium, where he thought it was impossible to produce anything original or authentic anymore. Next, we have Gabriel Orozco, a Mexican artist and avid world traveler. His nomad lifestyle strongly informs his work, which takes much inspiration from exploring the streets of different cities. He intends to break away from a practice involving huge studios and many assistants to mainly work alone. His explorations of found materials allow the audience to imagine associations between often ignored objects in the everyday world. Finally, we see Martin Creed, a UK artist from Glasgow, best known for his deadpan and deceptive humor. While winning the 2001 Turner Prize with his work The Lights Going On and Off, he continues to question the seriousness of minimalist and Fluxus-inspired aesthetics and to consider the possibility of appreciating these genres in more light-hearted ways. Similarly to the latter, my own creative approach is to appropriate the imagery of established artists and lead these to yet unexplored directions. So far, I have reviewed the works of Daniel Buren to produce similar imagery via video projection mapping, a technique Buren has never used himself. Also with Sol LeWitt, I reproduced his cube structure by using IKEA tables to clash his minimalist art production with the equally minimalist style of the global furniture brand. With Peter Haley, I applied his visual vocabulary to express less detached and more effective issues. And I also often appropriate from other sources, such as Google's search engine, to produce this series in many forms. To conclude, I'd like to refer back to my research method, which I defined as Marxian. This way to question not so much the validity of his ideas, but to question the validity of its application, for example within socialism. Instead of keeping the aim of these ideals to an egalitarian distribution of wealth, perhaps we should reassess these as aiming for an egalitarian restructuring of social responsibilities, for all to equally act on the social tasks of production, policy, governance, and so on. All this to say that this redistribution is hinted at in the practices of the artists I have presented you today, as well as within my own work. In this approach of undivided labor, under the form of unspecialized artistic practices and of creative mobility, I hope you will agree that this aesthetic stance is better suited to promote the emergence of social mobility and agency.